Hi, and welcome to the seventh review video. This one is about the industrialization unit. In it, we will again look over the readings from this unit, looking first at the role of industrialization in Europe, then looking at how that affected the rest of the world, and finally checking out how migrations were motivated by some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. We'll also look at the two history labs from this unit. The first one goes back a little bit before the Industrial Revolution to look at the role of science in the pre-industrial and then industrial world. And then history lab number 11 looks at the role of new social classes and the development of Marxism. The first reading is from a book called Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert. And this chapter that we read is all about how industrialization really reshaped European societies. Prior to industrialization, you have almost everybody working on farms, working for themselves. The idea of time and what time it is, and the idea of currency exist, but they're not really fundamental to people's day-to-day lives. That really changes once people get pushed into factory work. One of the things that this article emphasizes is how people got pushed into factory work. And one of the ways that that happened is that governments like the British government did things to take land away from farmers. The Enclosure Acts were examples of these things where they enclosed off land so that people couldn't just farm on it anymore. And then to make money, people were forced to move into these new factory jobs. The reason that this happened in the first place, this first point here, is that Britain industrialized because of the fact that there was so much coal just sitting around in England. Steam engines were developed basically to pump water out of coal mines so that they could dig deeper coal mines and get even more coal out. Part of the reason for this is because they didn't want to burn all the trees down for fuel because there's a limited number of forests in England. They were burning a ton of coal. And then eventually they realized over time with the gradual perfection of the steam engine that they could use it for other sorts of work, to produce cheap cotton textiles and compete globally with societies like India that had previously been clothing much of the world. The societal consequences are really key to this article. Children and women really entered the workforce during this time period. It changed the role of women's rights, I would say, in society, and that women suddenly were not just in the household, but they were also out there in society making money, providing for the family. Wage labor is a really different thing. If what you've been doing before is living as a farmer and bartering some of your goods and trading things and not using money particularly often, the idea that you show up at a job and get paid for your work is really, really different. This movement towards factories also forced people into what we think of as urbanization movements, moving people into cities where they were living closer to these factories. I'd like also to emphasize that there's two industrial revolutions really that we talk about. The first one is what's described in this article, and it's the one that's focused on steam power. It's focused on the extraction of coal and burning coal to produce that steam power, and it's about using that steam power to create, in particular, in this time period, cotton textiles. And that means that this system is really highly interwoven into the global economy of mercantilism and slave plantations that are producing cotton that then get sent back to the European home countries and get turned into those textiles. So to jump back a little bit, History Lab number 10 was about looking at scientific revolutions and what allowed them to happen or what prevented them from happening. Some of the documents in this lab show, for example, the Galileo reading and the Catholic Church's response to Galileo, that religion was frequently an impediment to scientific progress. And in fact, science was often funded by religious leaders, but it was only funded to the extent that it confirmed religious ideas. When science challenged religious ideas, it got shut up rather quickly. The other thing that this meant is that things that are really useful, like math, were not used as a basis for confirming or proving or describing scientific theories. If you think about it, math is essentially a language that's used to describe things in science. But that really wasn't the case until the scientific revolution in Europe in the 1600s. This Newton text talks a lot about the idea of using observation to describe the world. And one of the ways that you use observation is you can create mathematical models to do that. This is really transformative for science because instead of just looking at things and making some guesses about them, you can actually use math to do real prediction and real description of what's going on around you. And so the scientific revolution is really big for astronomers in that way. There's a lot of people in this time period: Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, all these guys who are looking at orbits, they're looking at planets, at stars, and they're using math to describe what they see going on in the universe. The later documents in this unit show things like the steam engine. They show the location of coal deposits in England, which was really crucial to where industry started. And in the steam engine models, what we see is not a revolution where there's some great inventor who shows up and creates this thing that instantly revolutionizes society. What we see is these slow, gradual improvements over time from a variety of inventors. And so the steam engine itself goes through various iterations. The original one, the Newcomen steam engine before the Watt steam engine, is really not very good. It's not very efficient. It loses a ton of energy. It's obviously very cumbersome. It's like this huge brick thing that you obviously couldn't put into, say, a railway line. But over time, you have improvements to it, and it gets shrunk down, and it gets made more efficient until you can put a steam engine into a locomotive, and you can drive a train with it. And one of the pieces of evidence in this history lab was a map of the increasing number of railroad lines throughout Europe in this time period, throughout England in particular. And what you'll notice there is those railway lines originally connect all the coal deposits together because you need something to take the coal from one place to another. So all of this stuff is really self-reinforcing and builds upon itself. Now we'll touch upon what I think is really the most important article in this unit, and I highly recommend looking back over it as you prepare for the AP test. It's Botany, Chemistry, and Tropical Development. I think of this article as a kind of sequel to Southernization because it really continues some of the themes of Southernization. If you think back to Unit 3, the idea of Southernization is that the Global South had access to and production of many essential goods in the world market. And so places like China and India, the Islamic Caliphate, Southeast Asia, created things that were incredibly profitable and were very desirable. And places like Europe ended up creating these crazy navigational routes around Africa and to the Americas to try to get at this stuff that they couldn't produce otherwise. You can't simply take a plant that grows in, say, Southeast Asia and transport it to Germany and hope that it grows, given the difference in climate. And as we switch from the pre-industrial era to the industrial era, suddenly there's a whole new set of products that Europe needs that are produced by the Global South. Rubber is probably the most important for machine parts, for automobiles, for bicycles, for all sorts of things. Dyes are really important if you think about the cotton textile industry. And so this article tracks the ways in which Europe got those things. It starts off by talking about European imperialism and colonization of various places in the Global South. We talked about that some in the last unit, about these trading post empires that eventually turn into European control of various places in Asia and the Middle East and the Americas and eventually Africa. And botany is a really big part of this. You take plants like the rubber tree and you move it to somewhere else and you try to grow it in your plantations in the Americas. That happened quite a bit. These plants were incredibly valuable. There was all sorts of like corporate or economic espionage, you could say. But then what comes around is what's called the Second Industrial Revolution. And this Industrial Revolution is much more focused upon things like chemistry and steel and synthetics in particular. And what this article shows is that the development of synthetics made a lot of the products of the global south no longer so important for Europe. It allowed Europe to produce in laboratories the sorts of things that they were formerly creating colonies for. And this was really valuable to Europe because it meant that they weren't quite so dependent upon these faraway places. But it also meant that the colonies, the European colonies, once they became free of colonial rule, which we'll talk about in Unit 9 when we talk about decolonization, got really stuck because they'd been in this cycle of raw material production for a really long time. And once they became less important to Europe, they were still left without any sort of industrial base. Europeans weren't going to, say, Indonesia in order to build factories. They were going there to harvest their various goods, to harvest rubber, to harvest spices, dyes, whatever they needed. And so countries that remained stuck essentially 100, 200 years in the past because they hadn't industrialized yet were left at this huge disadvantage when they suddenly gained independence because they didn't have the sorts of things that were really valuable in the global market. They had some raw materials, but they didn't have the wealth to be able to quickly industrialize. And so they were just kind of stuck in that place. And I think this does a really good job when you take it together with Southernization of seeing how rich the global South was and how influential it was, and then seeing how poor it ended up. Despite the fact that it continued to be influential, seeing how European imperialism and lack of development really left the global South out of luck in the modern era, and even so today. So back to Europe, this history lab really goes better with the Mobilizing Industrial Labor article. And it's called Class Struggles because I think that the key development of the industrial era is the idea of these new classes, particularly what Marx called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie basically comes down to the ownership class. They are the people who own the factories, who hire the labor, and who reap the benefits of most of what's going on, the vast majority of the profits. This is a new group of people in the world, and it creates some very kind of uncomfortable political tension in a lot of places that we'll touch on in Unit 8. The other group that gets created is the proletariat. And so instead of having peasants or serfs or just kind of regular old farmers, you now have factory workers who are getting paid wages for their labor. And that is what Marx described as the proletariat, and their lives were not particularly pleasant, as you can see from some of the sources and from the Mobilizing Industrial Labor article. The rules were harsh, you were penalized if you were late, if you made mistakes, the wages were low, workers were often women and children who had very little kind of ability to fight back against rules like this or against low wages. And what Marx saw when he looked at this is he saw a really unstable system. He saw something that was going to fall apart because he felt that at some point this would become so unbearable to workers that they were bound to revolt. He felt that industrialization was the last piece of the puzzle before you had these worker rebellions and revolutions that would put in communism, that would basically get rid of the useless, parasitic, blood-sucking bourgeoisie class and replace it with worker ownership and shared ownership of all the means of production. So we read a chunk of the Communist Manifesto where he describes some of this, and he talks about the patterns of history that got him to this conclusion. The rest of this history lab, I think, compares really nicely the attitude and opinions of the bourgeoisie with the attitudes and opinions of the proletariat. And if you look at the perspective of the bourgeoisie, what they suggest is that, oh, the workers are pretty well off, they're happily making money, and they're working hard because they want to rise up in society, which is only possible if they follow the rules and work really hard. Honestly, given the wages that they were making, this isn't really a very credible argument. But it certainly makes the bourgeoisie feel like they're doing what they can to help the proletariat. From the perspective of the proletariat in this history lab, you've got these owners who are basically taking all the good stuff, taking all the money that's being made from the factory work without really doing any of it themselves other than owning the stuff. And so a lot of these documents talk about the need for workers to unite, to work together, to overthrow the bourgeoisie as the owners of all the means of production. This doesn't really happen immediately after industrialization. It takes quite a while before there's any sort of communist overthrow of an established society. and that society in Russia wasn't even industrialized fully yet, which is not what Marx would have predicted. However, it does allow workers to unionize, to gain some collective strength, and it creates a series of reforms such as minimum wage laws and child labor laws and worker safety laws that eventually make the conditions of working in factories somewhat more bearable. There's one other thing that's important to point out in this history lab, and that's that industrialization was going on in Europe, but it was also going on fairly successfully in Japan and the United States in this time period, that those were the other kind of early industrialized nations, I would say. They gained quite a competitive advantage over places that had not yet industrialized. And we'll talk about that more in Unit 8 as well when we look at what Jack Goldstone calls advanced organic societies that had not moved into the industrial modern world. Okay, so the last reading here is the one about immigration to and from South America. And this migration is deeply tied to industrialization. Basically, industrialization pushed immigrants out of really crowded urban societies in a lot of cases. Imagine if you had grown up being raised on a farm and slowly you got pushed into factory work and you didn't much care for the lack of autonomy and the fact that you were now sort of in this proletariat class. A lot of people ended up leaving Europe or leaving Asia and going to the Americas, going to Southeast Asia in some cases, and looking for agricultural work that they could do. And part of the reason that agricultural laborers were needed, particularly in the Americas, was due to the abolition of slavery throughout the Americas in the 1800s. And just because slavery was abolished didn't mean that cotton wasn't in really high demand still because of these new factories that were using steam power to make textiles. So they needed replacement workers on many of these old plantations to replace the slaves that had been working there. It's true that freed slaves often got pulled back in. There were sharecropping systems in North America, but there were also tons of migrants from Europe, from China, who were doing a lot of this work. This article focused on South America, and it looked at some of the racial attitudes that popped up as new immigrants showed up. And there are some interesting things. The first part of the article talks about how Italian laborers showed up in Argentina and quickly moved out of the rural farming areas and actually moved to the cities in Argentina and started mobilizing with their Marxist views that they'd brought over from Europe and how they were seen as really a threat to the stability of the societies. There's also a look at how Japanese were seen in Brazil, how they were looked upon as being hardworking, but also being somewhat isolated in a lot of times in cultural enclaves. And then the article concludes with a backwards labor migration. South America went through a real economic crisis in the 20th century, and so many folks who had had grandfathers who were immigrants, grandparents who had come over, great-grandparents, moved back to their country of origin or their grandparents' country of origin with some mixed results. They were often down at the bottom of the social ladder in the country that they'd moved back to, even though they fit in some ways, sort of in the racial hierarchy there. So there's two key points, I guess. I mean, one is that steamships allowed people to travel when they wanted to, much more quickly, at lower cost, with less risk a lot of times. But it's also that since the world is industrialized, people have gone where the jobs are. And so human migrations over the past 200 years have been far more prevalent. Millions of people have switched continents compared to what was going on in the thousands of years of history before that. That's one of the reasons populations in the Americas spike in the late 1800s is due to this huge influx of migration. Okay, so we're at the end of this video. Here is a sample AP question. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's a cause and effect question, and it just wants you to look at the causes and effects of the Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 18th century. So I recommend as you look at this that you come up with a big kind of comprehensive cause and a big interesting effect that you have a lot to say about. Sketch out what some of the evidence would be, what key points you would bring in. At this point, you should pause the video so you can work on this so that you don't accidentally go on to the answer slide. All right, so I'm going to move ahead at this point. You should have hopefully worked on this question. Here are some simple causes, I think, of the Industrial Revolution. I think the availability of coal in Britain is a huge cause, just kind of the fortuitousness of having raw materials in Britain that were needed for industrialization was really important. And along with coal is the fact that the steam engine was built in order, or invented initially, in order to pump water out of coal mines so that they could get more coal to burn, which led to the need for better steam engines, which led to more coal being produced and more steam engines, and this had a positive feedback loop that proved really fortuitous for Britain. There were also some other factors, not resource-based, but capitalism in Europe was thriving. There were laws that protected innovation, that encouraged innovation, patent laws that allowed inventors to make money off of what they invented. And this sort of stuff really allowed innovation in this time period to thrive, and all sorts of useful stuff was invented based upon the new discoveries of the industrial era. And so there was this nice mixture of both resources and economics that really drove this thing. In terms of effects, I started here with a couple bullet points about global effects. It definitely led to European dominance of the textile market. It crashed India's economy. It allowed Britain to produce way cheaper cotton goods than India was producing, despite the fact that India had been the king of the cotton market for a thousand years easily. It also allowed for new forms of military technology. Steamships were really important. Ships with like iron siding was useful. This allowed for Europeans to take over places that they'd never dreamed of. It allowed for successful wars against China, like the Opium Wars. It allowed eventually, with the discovery of anti-malarial drugs like quinine, for Europeans to go in and colonize Africa and exploit resources like rubber there. And then locally, domestically in Europe, it created this wage system and it pushed women and children into factories. And so there were new roles for workers that hadn't previously existed. At the bottom here, you can see a sample thesis that sums all of that up in a way that I think would allow you to write about a bunch of this stuff if you were to be working on this on the AP test. I hope this video was helpful for you, and tune in for the next one, which will be Unit 8 about modernity.